King Louis II Jagiellon of Bohemia, Hungary, Dalmatia, Croatia, Slavonia, etc. had already been crowned when his father died on the 13th of March 1516. King Vladislav II arranged for his sons' coronations in 1508 and 1509 respectively, to quash any challenge to the succession and sidestep the process for electing a king. As Louis was to be the third child king of Hungary and Croatia in a century, King Vladislav had appointed guardians for Louis. Officially, his guardians were his uncle, King Sigismund of Poland-Lithuania, and his grandfather-in-law, Emperor Maximilian von Habsburg of the Holy Roman Empire. But King Vladislav had to appoint local guardians in Hungary, as the two reigning monarchs could not actually perform these duties, having to run their own realms, and the estates of the realm of St. Stephen, wanting to avoid another King Vladislav V situation, were also not allowing the underage king to leave the country, much to the outrage of the Bohemian estates, where power had to be assumed by a regency. Among these guardians was King Vladislav's nephew, Margrave George of Brandenburg-Ansbach, who was also one of the biggest landholders in the realm, having inherited his estates from his late wife Beatrice Frankopan, who was widow to John Corvinus, illegitimate son to the previous king, Matthias I Corvinus. Another guardian was John Bornemisza, Castellan of Buda, and former treasurer, and son of a peasant. There was also the old Palatine, Emeric Perigny, who had held the office since 1504, and King Louis's tutors, the elderly, disgraced and corrupt Cardinal Thomas Bakac, Archbishop of Esztergom, and his protege Chancellor Bishop George St. Mary of Pécs. These men were experienced and loyal to the king, old and new, but according to their enemies in the royal council and the diet of the realm, the king was surrounded by interfering foreigners, pretentious commoners, doddering old magnates, and corrupt clerics, all of whom were incompetent, as they had failed to solve the pressing problems the realm was facing for decades. The main opponents of these men were the leaders of the biggest faction of the minor nobility which dominated the Diet. One was Stephen Verbozzi, minor noble, constitutional scholar, orator and ideologue of the minor nobility. The other was the voivode of Transylvania, Janos Zapola, war hero, repressor of the recent peasant rebellion and the richest magnate of the realm, who had made himself out to be the champion of the poor minor nobility. The Diet of the realm of St. Stephen, summoned soon after Louis' succession, decided to appoint a regency council, consisting of 12 members from the ranks of the magnates and great prelates, and 16 from the ranks of the general nobility. This naturally caused paralysis and conflict in government, which did cause problems, but these sorts of factional divisions were nothing unusual for European monarchies of the age, and all that was usually needed was to wait out until the king came of age and became the arbiter between the factions. But the realm of St. Stephen faced an existential threat. The Ottoman Empire was conducting constant border raids that had been devastating and draining the realm's defenses and finances for the last 50 to 60 years. The realm was defended by natural barriers, such as the Carpathian and Dinarid mountain ranges. In their passes and along the Danube and other rivers was a system of fortresses founded over a century before by King Sigismund and strengthened half a century later by King Matthias. But the fortress system was cracking. One of the key fortresses, Srebrenik, had fallen in 1512, and unrelenting Ottoman raids never gave enough time for the economic, societal, and military systems to recover. The realm's economy was also feeling the effects of the peasant uprising of 1514. The demoralized and economically disincentivized peasantry did no more than the required minimum of work. There was a fear that another peasant uprising might break out at any moment, as one did in Slavonia over taxes upon Louis' succession, but it didn't escalate or spread. There was also a fear that the peasants will simply betray their lords to the Turk. The repeal, suspension, or just not implementation of the anti-peasant laws and measures passed following the suppression of the peasant uprising of 1514 didn't do much to fix the situation, as most laws that increased peasant burdens, limited their economic activity, and systematically forced the peasantry into effective serfdom were implemented before 1514. This is not even mentioning the fact that peasants were fleeing en masse from raided and devastated areas where manpower was needed most, or they were killed or dragged off into slavery by Ottoman raiders. To avoid the devastation, some landholders on the border made secret deals with the Ottomans, allowing their raiders safe passage and giving the Sultan tribute, just to spare their lands. But sometimes that was not enough, as a deal made with one Ottoman pasha didn't necessarily apply to another. The raids, the devastation and exhaustion of the defensive system allowed the Ottoman border beys to easily take over minor castles that surrounded and supported the great fortresses, cutting them off from supply and strangling them. One of these fortresses was Jajce. Ban Peter Berislavić, viceroy of Dalmatia, Croatia and Slavonia, led several campaigns to relieve and resupply the fortress as the castles around it fell. Sparing the realm for the moment was the fact that Sultan Selim I and the majority of Ottoman forces were occupied with the invasions of Syria and Egypt, and rumors were spreading that the Sultan had suffered a catastrophic defeat there. The belief in these rumors was reinforced when the Sultan's envoys arrived in Buda in April of 1516, asking for a truce. The Sultan suffered no such defeat, and simply wanted to avoid a war on two fronts. He also hoped that a truce would encourage Emperor Maximilian I von Habsburg and King Francis I of France to continue their war in Italy, and ignore Pope Leo X's pleas for peace and cooperation, as in case of a truce, the urgency of the Ottoman threat would be reduced. But there would be no truce with the Sultan. The estates didn't want to give the Ottomans time to reinforce their newly acquired positions, especially not if the Sultan had indeed suffered a defeat in the east. And since any truce would still mean the continuation of the border raids, it seemed to be a meaningless gesture. As Stephen Verbozzi put it, "The country is destroyed more during truces than during war." King Louis's counselors wrote to King Sigismund and Emperor Maximilian, begging them for a concentrated European effort against the Sultan. If this realm is now unable to repel such partial incursions, what will happen if that Lord of the Turks, having arranged things in Asia, turns all his might and rage against the realm of his Majesty, to which he fully aspires? After the conquest of Syria and Egypt in 1517, the Ottoman Empire had a territory 5 times the size of Louis's realms, with 3 to 4 times the population. The Sultan had an income of 4 to 5 million florins per annum, while Louis had 4 to 500,000. The Sultan commanded a standing army at his beck and call of over 100,000 soldiers, while Louis could slowly muster an army of around 30 to 40,000 noble banners and some mercenaries, if he was lucky. In the Ottoman Empire, the decentralized feudal realm of St. Stephen faced what some call the first centralized absolutist state in Europe. The beginning of the 16th century saw a new generation of young rulers ascend to the most prominent thrones in Europe. King Henry VIII ascended in 1509 at the age of 17 to the crown of England and lordship of Ireland. King Francis I became King of France in 1515 at the age of 21, and in 1516, around the same time as King Louis ascended to Bohemia, Hungary and Croatia, and after the death of King Ferdinand II of Aragon, the 16-year-old Charles von Habsburg, Duke of Burgundy and Lord of the Netherlands, was acclaimed as King of the Crowns of Spain in Brussels, along with his mother, Joanna la Loca. Charles's succession to Spain was not a certainty. He had never been to the country before inheriting the throne. He was born and raised in Burgundy and the Low Countries, areas he ruled over since the death of his father Philip in 1506. Many among the Spanish estates resented the idea of a foreign king, preferring either his mother, who was deemed to be mentally unstable, or Charles's brother Ferdinand, who was born and raised in Spain. The brothers had not even met until Charles's arrival to claim the Spanish throne in 1517. Upon his arrival, the Spanish estates demanded that Charles dismiss his Flemish advisors. But growing up in Burgundy and the Netherlands, Charles had been educated in the arts of negotiation and compromise with the estates, otherwise known as threats and bribery. Concessions were offered to the various cortes of the Spanish crowns, whose grandees were showered with titles, lucrative positions, and memberships in the Order of the Golden Fleece. And eventually, by 1518, Charles was recognized as King of Spain, along with his mother. In February of 1518, at one of the gatherings of the estates, his brother Ferdinand was the first to swear allegiance to the new king. Soon after, Ferdinand was sent to govern the Netherlands, to the disappointment of those who had hoped they could turn the brothers against each other. The Habsburg succession to Spain drastically altered the balance of power in Europe. The new King of France feared being surrounded by Habsburg realms and their allies, and the prospects of Charles succeeding his grandfather as Holy Roman Emperor made many fear the possibility of Habsburg hegemony over Europe. Even so, the new King of France had managed to improve his geopolitical position in 1515 by successfully invading Milan and dethroning the Sforzas again. He also strengthened the authority of the French crown over the Gallican Church by negotiating the Concordat of Bologna with Pope Leo X in 1516. The same year was spent negotiating a peace settlement to what had begun as the War of the League of Cambrai in 1508, ending with the peace treaties of Noyon and Brussels. Milan was recognized as belonging to King Francis, Naples to King Charles of Spain, while Brescia and Verona were to be returned to Venice. Well, Verona was not directly returned to Venice. Emperor Maximilian agreed to first give it to Charles of Spain, who gave it to Francis of France, who then gave it to Venice. Where have I seen this before? Venice had survived the War of the League of Cambrai, of which the initial aim had been to destroy its position in northern Italy, with its territories more or less intact, thanks to some clever and desperate diplomacy and a miraculous turn of events. But just as Italy stabilized, the Ottoman Sultan Selim I had conquered Egypt and Syria, and Venetian Middle Eastern trade was effectively finished, at least in previous volumes. The Sultan had nominally allowed the ports of Beirut and Alexandria to remain open for trade, but the centralizing nature of the Ottoman Empire forced merchants to move trade towards Constantinople. The Middle Eastern trade routes had also started to dry up due to the Portuguese redirecting Indian Ocean trade around the Cape, and to add to the problems, Emperor Maximilian had been putting in efforts to redirect German trade away from Venice and towards Antwerp. This situation necessitated a change in Venetian economic strategy, and it refocused away from trade to domestic production, for which the raw materials would be provided from its territories in the terra firma and the Stato da Mar. This change in Venetian economic policy and the Ottoman Wars and increased piracy would also begin the decline of the Adriatic trade, and consequently the decline of the Dalmatian communes. Well, apart from one. With peace established in Italy, Pope Leo X had hoped this would be the moment to unite Christendom behind a new crusading effort. The idea was that Emperor Maximilian, the kings of France, Poland, Lithuania, Bohemia, Hungary, and Croatia would each lead armies of around 60,000 men down to Constantinople, while the Spanish and Portuguese navies broke through the Dardanelles, and after the capture of Constantinople, they would all advance towards Jerusalem, or even Alexandria. The idea was fanciful and unrealistic, but it was part of a response to pleas for aid from the realm of St. Stephen. The Bishop of Modrus had given an impassioned speech at the Lateran Council, reprimanding the Church Fathers for building gilded palaces, while churches were being desecrated and the faithful peasants dragged away into slavery. The bishop warned that if help was not sent, the realm would make an accommodation with the Turk, or that the peasants would rise up and join the enemy. The Gilded Palace's accusation echoed wider reformist sentiments at the Lateran Council. Among the great problems of the church was that of absenteeism, as many of the great prelates held multiple bishoprics, most of which they had never visited, and used them as sources of revenue. There was also the fact that many of these absentee bishops were too young to hold bishoprics. But the most egregious problem, however, remained that of the indulgences. Pieces of paper that promised salvation from hell and or purgatory in exchange for a sacrifice of money. Money that was then to be spent on the new crusade, the defense of Christendom, maintenance of the papal state and of the church in general, on new and renovated churches, artistic patronage, and luxury expected of the younger sons of the European nobility, but not exactly the heirs of the apostles. Calls for reform of the Holy Mother Church to deal with these problems that had plagued it since before the Council of Constance a century ago came to nothing. The Lateran Council closed in early 1517, with no significant changes. The Church living off of the sins of Christendom was a moral and theological problem over a century old, but a new active push to sell indulgences for the financing of the crusade and the renovations to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome came amidst an era of socio-economic crisis in Europe. The problem for the Church became pronounced in the Holy Roman Empire, because the clergy there held more authority and influence in their own domains and in the empire as a whole than in any other European realm. As we have seen elsewhere, social and economic disparity was increasing. Peasants' rights were being curtailed due to workers leaving estates. Wealthy urban cities were coming into conflict with landed nobility. Minor knights and nobles of the empire angrily demanded more rights as their status, wealth, and influence diminished. A peasant revolt of the poor Conrads had already broken out against the Duke of Württemberg in 1514 and was violently repressed. Added into all this was the fear of the advancing Turkish menace, and instead of fighting it, wars were waged against Christian brothers in Italy. And sitting atop this wobbling structure that was called an empire was an ambitious but tired old man, who seemed to have conquered Europe through holy matrimony. The Diet of the Realm of St. Stephen met for its regular session in early 1518. Matters of defense and financing of the same were pressing topics, as were the diplomatic appeals for and against the truce with the Sultan. The papal ambassador had been assuring the court in Buda that the preparations for a united crusading effort were underway and that no truce with the Sultan should be made. Regardless of this, the Estates of the Realm rejected the Sultan's offers, as a truce practically meant little. Raids would continue anyway, and there was no immediate danger of invasion, as it was rumored that Sultan Selim was still in the Middle East with a weakened army. Which wasn't true, but Selim had little interest in turning north in the near future anyway. Besides, many in the Diet thought that it might indeed be a better idea to face the Sultan on the field of battle, instead of suffering this continued deterioration on the border. For after all, the Hungarian nobility were naturally skilled warriors, heirs of the Scythians and of Attila. Of course they would defeat the Great Turk if he ever decided to stop cowering and properly invaded. They'd even attack him and beat him if only they were allowed to by the corrupt, treacherous cowards and foreigners around the crown. The minor nobility of the Diet demanded that if the Sultan would not come to them, that the fight be taken to him. They didn't care where, when, or with what means. They demanded action, and after all, the young king would certainly lead them to victory, like the young King Matthias from decades before. Never mind the fact that Matthias had been risk-averse and avoided facing the Sultan. Never mind the fact that Matthias's army had been disbanded and the economy that paid for it destroyed. Never mind the fact that all of the experienced commanders of Matthias's wars were dead, and that the current generation, for all their successes, did not have the same experience of large-scale war, nor had the means to deal even with raiding parties. It was not unusual for boastful minor nobles to make inflammatory statements at the Diet. They also tended to leave early for their own estates as they ran out of money, and wanted to make a big impact. So the royal councillors and magnates ignored them, and focused on administrative and financial matters that also favored them. But this time, almost the entire minor nobility abandoned the Diet in protest, proclaiming that they would gather again on their own initiative in the summer at Tolna, to the south of Buda. Sometimes, when the Diet met away from Buda, it was to gather for military campaign. Between the two Diets, the situation on the border deteriorated. The undersupplied and under-equipped fortress of Belgrade was put under siege. Many of its cannons had been taken by Voivod Janos Zapolya on his failed campaign into Serbia in 1515 and had not been replaced. But Belgrade held out. The fortress of Jajce was also put under siege again, and Ban Berislavić struggled to mount a relief effort, as the estates of Slavonia were refusing to finance the defense of anything outside of their territory. To remedy this, Berislavić had demanded to be appointed to the vacant bishopric of Zagreb, so that he could at least have access to the resources from one of the biggest landed estates in the Kingdom of Slavonia. But due to previous conflicts with Berislavić, the primate of the realm, Cardinal Bakac, had so arranged matters to ensure his nephew, Simon Erdodi, became the new bishop of Zagreb. Berislavić was thus forced to beg for aid from Emperor Maximilian von Habsburg, who had been expanding his influence among the Croatian estates by supplying and financing their defense, and through them the defense of Austria. The Diet of Tolna met in July, first only attended by representatives of the county nobility and the self-representing minor nobles, and when it became clear that this gathering mass of armed and angry nobles could not be ignored, the king, council, magnates and prelates decided to join the Diet, retroactively making it an official and legal gathering. To calm tensions, the king dismissed Bishop St. Mari as chancellor on accusations of corruption, and replaced him with the royal treasurer Ladislav Šalkaj, the Bishop of Vach, who just happened to be St. Mari's protégé. The Diet ordered that Ban Berislavić and our old friend Lawrence of Ilok were to be dispatched with supplies and money to relieve the fortress of Jajce, which was successful. It was also decided that the king would lead the assembled nobility on campaign to somewhere, to be decided later, as the Turks had withdrawn from Belgrade. Another Diet would be summoned at Bach in September, but that Diet would also not go on military campaign, due to lack of funds. The new chancellor was replaced at the treasury by two allegedly incompetent nobles, but I'm not sure their competence or lack thereof mattered, for it seems that most of the nobility could not grasp the full scope of the financial problem they were in. They wanted it resolved in a short period of time without radically changing the system. The treasury did what it could with consent of the Diet. Revenues were restored from mortgaged royal estates, the royal salt and silver monopolies were re-established, tariffs on cattle exports were raised, and a new round of emergency taxes implemented. The plan was to raise 2 million florins in 3 years. But the systemic problem was in tax collection. As taxes went up the chain, the nobles that collected them were allowed to take a portion of the revenues to cover their own military expenses. This system was of course ripe for abuse, and as the nobility and clergy were constitutionally exempt from taxes, according to the Bull of 1222, a disproportionate burden was placed on the only other entity that had substantial sums of money and could legally be taxed, and that was hated by the nobility that controlled the Diet, the free royal cities, who either refused to or couldn't pay the new higher taxes. Meaning that the money, instead of being concentrated in the royal treasury, was dispersed across the realm, and what did reach the treasury was insufficient to meet the increasing needs of the military and defensive systems, making the realm dependent on the goodwill of the nobility and foreign aid. The two treasurers were dismissed a year or two later, and replaced by the far more capable cleric Paul Varadai, but even he couldn't meet the demands and expectations of the estates that wanted the glory of King Matthias without having to pay for it. The Diets had also passed other laws and measures, but how much any of these were obeyed is up for debate, between selectively or not at all. As part of another round of diplomatic missions to ask for aid, the Croatian emissary Francis Tarquin Andreas addressed the Imperial Diet in Augsburg in 1518. He finished his speech by reprimanding the German estates for their infighting, their repugnant stubbornness, and their mercenary ways. It is well known that each of you would sooner part with your lives than with your stance. These years there hasn't been a war among Christians in which a German mercenary did not fight for gold. You refuse your fellow brothers in Christ, who have reached out their hands to you. Where is that fire, you Germans, to take up arms and fight for a common cause? At the same Diet in Augsburg, the papal legate Cardinal Thomas Cajetan was conducting the questioning of a German Augustinian preacher by the name of Martin Luther. Just the year before, he had caused quite a commotion among the German clergy and people with his public stance against the indulgence practices of the Holy Mother Church, and his attacks on the authority of his superiors, which had made him quite popular in discontent Germany. This popularity also spread some of his other questionable teachings to a wider audience. The arrogance and conviction with which Luther defended himself and refused to adapt his views to be more in line with the official accepted theology and authority meant that this interview in Augsburg turned into a theological brawl. The problems the Roman Catholic Church was facing at the beginning of the 16th century combined into a perfect storm of theological, European, and issues local to the Holy Roman Empire, when the Prince-Elector Archbishop of Mainz, Albert von Brandenburg, ordered a drastic increase in the sales of indulgences in 1517, with the purpose of, among other things, paying for the renovations of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The Prince-Elector Archbishop himself was simultaneously too young to hold a bishopric, and at the same time held too many bishoprics. He had also attained his prominent position in the Church and Empire through temporal influence. This sale of indulgences prompted a young Augustinian monk, priest and professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg in Saxony by the name of Martin Luther to send a very angry letter to the Prince-Elector Archbishop. For it is by no gift of a bishop that a man becomes sure of salvation. Why then do the preachers of pardons by these false fables and promises make the people careless and fearless? Works of piety and love are infinitely better than indulgences, and yet these are not preached. Nay, for the sake of preaching indulgences they are kept quiet. Luther writes that indulgences do not cause true repentance, and offer simply false security. He encloses with the letter a list of 95 theses, debate statements against the indulgences, and argues in a roundabout way against the authority that permits them. The Pope cannot remit any guilt except by declaring that it had been remitted by God. The Pope does well when he grants remissions to souls in purgatory by way of intercession. Christians are to be taught that if the Pope knew the exactions of the pardon preachers, he would rather that St. Peter's go to ashes than that it should be built up with the skin, flesh, and bones of his sheep. This unbridled preaching of pardons makes it no easy matter to rescue reverence due to the Pope from the shrewd questioning of the laity. Why does the Pope not empty purgatory for the sake of holy love? Why allow an impious man to buy out a pious friend, and do not rather, because of that pious and beloved soul, free it for pure love's sake? To repress these arguments of the laity by force alone, and not to resolve them by giving reason, is to expose the Church and the Pope to the ridicule of their enemies, and to make Christians unhappy. The same 95 theses Luther shares with his friends, other priests, monks, and intellectuals, and allegedly Luther nails them to the door of All Saints' Church and other churches in Wittenberg on the 31st of October 1517. He has them printed in 1518, and they spread like wildfire. Now, Luther's sentiments themselves were not exactly revolutionary nor extraordinary. Luther was not the first to criticize the state of affairs within the Holy Mother Church. There were, of course, Wycliffe and Huss over a century before, Savonarola 2 decades before. Then there were Luther's contemporaries, Erasmus of Rotterdam, Thomas More, Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples, and others. The numerous bishops at the Lateran Council and the Franciscans who were among the leaders of the recent peasant revolts, all of whom openly criticized the Church on this and other points. Luther's stunt might have gotten no more notice than any other, had it not been for the fact that it attacked at the right issue at the right time in the right place, and the fact that Luther himself was a stubborn, determined, arrogant young priest with conviction. His attacks on the indulgences struck a chord with the dissatisfied German population that felt it had been exploited beyond its limits, and on the tide of that sentiment Luther quickly became popular. His theology soon developed and moved from attacks on the indulgences to questioning the offerings during Mass, doubting transubstantiation, outright questioning the theological authority of the church councils and the Pope, to questioning the Church's role as intermediary between the human and the divine. And he refused to modify his views to be acceptable to his superiors. Luther preached that there can be no intermediaries between God and man, that solely through one's faith in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, as expressed solely in Holy Scripture, could salvation be possible, that no earthly deed can contribute to salvation, and that it is solely up to God's mercy. Luther's teachings spread fast through print on the coattails of the 95 Theses. From an intellectual perspective, Luther's teachings stood out from his contemporaries, as Luther does not exactly follow the humanist tradition that was popular among thinkers of the age. While humanism elevated man and made him capable, curious, and self-aware, Luther, ironically, a man with his own ideas who took a stand against the powers that be for the sake of his own personal conscience, shrunk man down and made him submissive and powerless. But these differences were not apparent right away. Many humanist intellectuals were supportive of Luther because he appeared to have gotten the ball rolling again on the question of church reform. But Luther's actions pulled at the thread of an entire institutional fabric in Europe. Luther's following also grew through public attacks and debates against other preachers, one of whom was the Dominican monk John Tetzel, who had been responsible for the indulgence campaign of the Archbishop of Mainz, and who in turn threatened Luther with the Inquisition and the stake. And Luther might have very well suffered that fate of many other heretics, had it not been for temporal politics. When Luther was called to stand trial in Rome in 1518, Luther's patron, Prince Elector of Saxony Frederick the Wise, intervened, and was not ready to hand the preacher over. Luther was going to be just one of the many bargaining chips in the upcoming imperial election. The old and ailing Emperor Maximilian was attempting to secure the election for his grandson Charles von Habsburg of Spain, but it was well known that Pope Leo X did not want Charles to inherit the imperial title, so the Pope could not risk antagonizing the Prince Elector. A compromise was reached. Instead of standing trial in Rome, Luther was to give testimony at the imperial diet in Augsburg in 1518, in front of papal legate Cardinal Cajetan, during which Luther refused to recant any of his teachings, instead insisting on a general church council whose decision the Pope would have to obey. And as all of this was going on, other men followed Luther's example. In Zurich, a priest by the name of Zwingli began preaching his own interpretation of the New Testament, influencing the Zurich City Council and beginning his own reform movement. While in Bohemia, just as things were beginning to settle after the estates reached an agreement on their economic divide, the rise of Luther caused religious divisions within the Hussite movement itself, with the moderate Hussites pushing for a closer union with Rome, while the radicals embraced Luther, pushing Bohemia once again onto the road towards civil war. In the year 1519, a very important position was vacated by the death of its occupant. Palatine Emeric Perigny of Hungary died, causing a somewhat tense session of the Diet of the Realm of St. Stephen, as Janos Zápolya was once again blocked from the palatinal office by the consolidation of his enemies, who united behind the magnate and now elected Palatine, Stephen Batory. The same year a more prominent title was in a similar position. On the 12th of January 1519, Emperor Maximilian I von Habsburg of the Holy Roman Empire died. His death caused some upheaval in Austria, especially in Vienna, where the Habsburg administrators were forced to acquiesce to demands of the rebelling mob. But more importantly, his death began the process of a new imperial election. And now I hand you over to me in our Decision 1519 studio. Thank you. For several months now, Europe has been expectantly awaiting the decision of the electorate of the Holy Roman Empire, all 7 of them. Over these months, the prince-electors have become the most influential and influenced men in Europe. As unlike previous elections, this one has a few prominent candidates from outside the Holy Roman Empire. The frontrunner and favorite, of course, is the late Emperor Maximilian's grandson Charles von Habsburg, King of Spain and its expanding overseas empire, King of Naples, Duke of Burgundy, and Lord of the Netherlands, who has also now inherited the family's Austrian possessions. Emperor Maximilian had attempted to elect and crown Charles as King of Germany and the Romans, that is to say imperial heir, before his death, most recently at the Diet of Augsburg last year, but he failed. The electors were hesitant, as many in Europe do not want Charles to succeed to the imperial throne. With his already vast wealth and power and familial alliances, many see it as tantamount to establishing Habsburg hegemony over Europe. But as much as some fear Charles, his position is not as secure as it seems, nor is the fear of him absolute. His dominion is divided into many parts, and he made arrangements with the local estates on how to rule those parts, and is promising the same to the imperial princes. And unlike his competitors, he is a German prince of a German house. Charles's main competitor is King Francis I of France, who has the backing of Pope Leo X. Both of them fear that they would find themselves surrounded by a Habsburg empire should Charles win the election. Francis is however disliked by the German estates for, well, being French, and they fear that the rich and powerful King of France, who rules a centralized and homogeneous kingdom, could attempt to impose his will by force, as the French kings had done in Italy in the now almost 3 decades past. Aware of this, both Francis and Pope Leo attempted to sway Prince-Elector Frederick the Wise of Saxony to throw his hat into the ring as a compromise candidate. The Prince-Elector is seen to have no external interest. He is an old and pious German prince, and he protects Luther. The controversial preacher has around the time of this election engaged in a public debate with theologian Johannes Eck, during which he has called the church councils fallible and papal authority the invention of the last 400 years, digging himself further into a heretical position, but I digress. The Prince-Elector has however refused to run for the imperial throne. He is elderly with neither the strength nor resources to take on the problems of the empire, nor challenge Charles if he decided to take the throne by force. The Elector of Brandenburg had also offered himself up as a compromise candidate, but due to his diplomatic shenanigans and putting conditions for his vote on the 2 frontrunners, he appears to not even have the support of his brother, the Elector of Mainz, who is firmly in Charles's camp, while Brandenburg seems to be closer to Francis. Another compromise candidate who had expressed interest in attaining the imperial crown is King Henry VIII of England, but it is doubtful that this candidacy was genuine, and appears to be more of a diplomatic stunt to leverage influence, as Henry is currently engaged in alliance negotiations with both Charles and Francis. The expenses of competing are also prohibitive for King Henry. King Louis II of Bohemia, Hungary, and Croatia has also been proposed as a compromise candidate, and by none other than Stephen Barbozi, who attempted to gain papal support for him. This choice would commit the resources of the empire to the defense of the Ottoman border, while also hurting the Habsburgs, who are somewhat detested in Hungary. But this candidacy appears to not have gotten much traction either. While we are on the subject of the King of Bohemia, we must of course discuss the vote of the Prince Elector of Bohemia. Both the estates of Bohemia and Hungary, as well as Louis's uncle and guardian, King Sigismund of Poland-Lithuania, have claimed the right to exercise the underage king's vote. The estates of Bohemia have gone so far as to declare the king of age, and demanded that he be sent to Prague from Buda in early 1519, to perform this and other duties of the King of Bohemia. The Hungarian estates have agreed to deliver the king to Prague in principle at a later date. It has been decided by the imperial estates that the Bohemian chancellor will exercise the vote in the king-elector's name, which, due to the marriage alliance with the Habsburgs, is very likely going to Charles. And thus we come to this moment of election in Frankfurt in June of 1519. The electors have been meeting for several days now, and any of the mentioned candidates need a simple 4 out of 7 majority to be elected. The two frontrunners have been evenly matched in terms of military strength, the threats they posed, and the promises they made. And large transfers of money lobbying efforts have been occurring between the candidates and several electors. The difference appears to be that while the King of France is paying out immediately, the late Emperor Maximilian had arranged for his bankers, mainly from the Fugger clan, to send out promissory notes that will be paid out later, if of course Charles is elected. It is alleged that the Fuggers have prepared over 2 tons of gold to be paid out should their candidate win. It has also been rumored that on one of the voting days the Prince Elector of Saxony has been elected as emperor, but he turned down the crown, as he had refused to vote for himself after gathering 3 votes. Afterwards it is said that he spoke in support of Charles, and we might have the results. Yes, on this day, the 28th of June 1519, after gathering the required majority in a show of unity and support for the new emperor, the electors have unanimously elected Charles von Habsburg as King of the Romans and of Germany, and elected Emperor Charles V. Back to me in the future. Thank you. It's said that for the rest of his life, that is to say the next few years, Jakob Fugger had frequently reminded Charles that he would not have succeeded without his help. With Maximilian's death and Charles's election, it would take time to clarify the new geopolitics of Europe. What path will the new elected emperor pursue? Meaning that any effort of an anti-Ottoman crusade was effectively abandoned, meaning that the realm of St. Stephen was once again left to its own devices. King Sigismund of Poland-Lithuania advised his nephew to make peace with the Sultan, because no help was coming. Sigismund himself had other concerns. The court in Buda had been negotiating a truce with the Sultan, and a secret agreement had been reached in March of 1519, with provisions that forbade the building of new fortresses on sections of the border, and stating that raids of up to 500 men were not considered breaches of the truce. The agreement was kept secret until the Sultan's positive reply came in the autumn. The envoy that brought it had been kept in honorable detention by Sultan Selim since 1516. The agreement saved the realm from immediate invasion, but favored the Ottomans, allowing them to continue as they had. The Pasha of Bosnia graciously informed the Croatian noble Ivan Karlović that he would be paying him a visit every 14 days. Meanwhile, Ban Berislavić of Dalmatia, Croatia and Slavonia was unable to receive any aid from Buda in 1519. The funds were not there, but he had received aid from the Pope, with a letter attached. For Croatia, the bulwark and bastion of Christendom, assuring the Ban of the papacy's continued support. On the 20th of May 1520, Ban Berislavić was chasing an Ottoman raiding party near Pleshevica mountain. One story goes that he fell off his horse and was killed while trying to fix the saddle. His body was carried to his bishopric of Veszprém and buried there. Before his death, Ban Berislavić sent a request for aid to the elected emperor in Brussels, which arrived in June of 1520. The emperor approved of sending some aid to the Ban, and a few days later he sent his condolences to King Louis for the loss of a capable commander. It is said that the Elector of Saxony's vast collection of holy relics would have entitled anyone that gave them due devotion to 1,902,202 years and 270 days off of their time in purgatory. God has given us a young and noble ruler to reign over us, and thereby awaken our hearts once more to hope. So said Martin Luther about the elected Emperor Charles V in the build-up to the coronation in Aachen in 1520. The same year, Luther also published 3 works: to the Christian nobility of the German nation, urging the young emperor and princes to reform the empire and church; on the Babylonian captivity of the church, in which he attacks the Pope and the 7 sacraments; and the philosophical theological work on the freedom of the Christian, which asserted that true faithful Christians are not bound to any laws, but willingly submit themselves to them. This could of course in no way be misinterpreted by the many Luther-inspired preachers now spreading their own interpretations of the Bible and Luther's writings throughout Germany and causing noticeable unrest. The elected emperor was however dismissive of the causa Lutheri. It was a matter for the church and local authorities. Charles focused on consolidating power in the empire and preparing for a conflict with the King of France. Some say to pave the way for the establishment of universal monarchy. Read Habsburg hegemony. However, at the same time, the difficulties of running a disjointed empire became apparent when a revolt of the Comuneros broke out in Spain. They wanted to replace Charles with his mother. Charles himself could not return to Spain at the moment, but his position was saved by his mother refusing the crown, allowing those loyal to Charles to deal with the revolt. On the 23rd of October 1520 in Aachen, Charles von Habsburg was crowned as King of the Romans and King of Germany. He swore the traditional oath to preserve the Christian faith, uphold the Holy Mother Church, care for the weak, and give due reverence to the Pope. In his coronation capitulations, he promised to defer to the imperial diet and the prince-electors on a number of issues. He agreed to not bring foreign mercenaries into the empire without their consent, and to only hire Germans for the imperial administration. Coincidentally, 1 month earlier, on the 22nd of September, Sultan Selim had died, and as all of his brothers and all but one of his sons were dead, he was peacefully succeeded by his son Suleiman. The First. Upon his succession, it was rumored that Suleiman that the new Sultan was a weak man with a peaceful nature. The Venetian ambassador describing him as a lamb, who did not wield much influence. Rumors also spread that he was facing opposition and rebellion, that he would be unable to rule nor wage war against Christendom. In fact, the new Sultan was facing unrest that would force him into a war with Christendom. His father had spent a good amount of religious and political capital waging war against other Sunni Muslims, so the new Sultan was faced with demands to fight a legitimate enemy and not wage a blatant war of conquest. The Beys in Europe also demanded that their raiding areas be expanded. Some say that, like Charles, the new Sultan was ambitious and viewed himself as a new Alexander, though I'm not sure whether he held that view of himself at the start of his reign. But regardless, by late 1520 the two emperors decided that they were going to war the following year. An Ottoman envoy arrived in Buda in December of 1520, with an offer to extend Sultan Selim's truce, but with deliberately unacceptable extortionate demands for tribute. It was hoped that any negotiation might stall King Louis II's preparations, and any delay or refusal could then be used as an excuse for war. The Diet of the Realm of St. Stephen was sitting when the Sultan's offer arrived, and while some amongst the magnates did advocate for negotiations, they were drowned out by the frenzied and boastful demands for war. What would be the point of negotiations other than an admission of impotence? The last truce was bad enough. Paying the Sultan tribute would also not guarantee any security, as the Ottomans interfered in the internal affairs of their tributaries. And after all, the Hungarians were descendants of the Scythians, who fought Alexander, of Attila, who defeated the Romans. Surely they would defeat the young and weak lamb of a sultan on the field of honor? Anyway, it had a better chance of working than continuing to watch the crumbling defensive system turn into an archipelago of fortified islands in a sea of devastated and depopulated land. In some areas, the situation was so bad that nobody was left to stop people from running away. And besides, there was no guarantee that the Sultan would actually march northwards. It had not happened in decades. So King Louis acquiesced to the frenzied demands of the Diet and threw the Sultan's envoy into the dungeon. This, of course, made Sultan Suleiman particularly angry. He was the only one that got to throw envoys in dungeons. He prepared to march northwards in the spring of 1521. At the Diet held in the imperial free city of Worms in the spring of 1521, elected Emperor Charles had hoped he would simply arrange for the governance of the empire in his absence and secure funds for a war with France. But many of the imperial princes insisted that the Diet take up the causa Luferi and give a hearing to the divisive preacher. Luther had once again refused to recant his teachings, and he burned the papal bull. Not that bull. And he burned the papal bull excommunicating him in late 1520, and he should have been arrested. But the matter had become so inflammatory that no prince opposed to Luther dared move against him without the emperor's backing, while Luther's supporters hoped a hearing would lead to imperial support for church reform. Luther stood defiant before the elected emperor and princes on the 18th of April 1521. He refused to accept any ultimate authority other than the word of God. So long as I cannot be disproved by holy writ or clear reason, I neither can nor will withdraw anything, for it is both criminal and dangerous to act against conscience. The elected Emperor Charles, himself a student of students of Luther's supporter Erasmus, was supportive of church reform. However, following the example of his ancestors, true sons and defenders of the Roman Church, he was determined to hold fast by all that has happened since the Council of Constance. For it is certain that a single monk must err if he stands against the opinion of all Christendom. Otherwise Christendom itself would have erred for more than 1,000 years. I regret that I have delayed so long as to proceed against him. I will not hear him again. He has his safe conduct, but from now on I regard him as a notorious heretic. The Diet ruled against Luther on the 30th of April. The Emperor issued the Edict of Worms ordering Luther's arrest and suppression of his teachings on the 8th of May. By that time, many of the princes that supported Luther and Luther himself had left the Diet. Charles, unlike Emperor Sigismund 100 years before, had kept his word about safe passage. At some point in his journey from the Diet, Luther was kidnapped and imprisoned in the castle of Wartburg by his patron, the Prince Elector of Saxony. As far as Charles was concerned, this was an end to the matter. The Diet accepted Charles's brother Ferdinand as imperial regent in Charles's absence, and later that spring, the King of France made preemptive moves against Charles in the Low Countries. Stephen Berdozzi had observed the Diet of Worms. Let me rephrase that. Stephen Berdozzi was present for Luther's hearing in Worms. He even spoke to Luther, and it left such an impression on him that after he returned to the realm of St. Stephen, he demanded that the anti-heretic laws be applied to Lutherans. But that became a secondary concern, as rumors circulated about a large Ottoman army moving northwards, an army of such size that the realm had not seen since the siege of Belgrade in 1456. The realm of St. Stephen was not at all ready to face the oncoming army of the Ottoman Sultan. King Louis summoned the noble banners in June of 1521, but it would take time for the army and supplies to gather. As for the money to pay for it, the treasury was almost empty. The Diet, held in early 1521, had consented to a scheme to devalue the currency in order to mint enough money to pay soldiers. But in June, emergency measures had to be taken. Extraordinary taxes were raised on the free royal cities, mainly because they had the money and couldn't resist like the other estates. When the Saxon cities in Transylvania objected, the king threatened them with loss of land, limb and liberties if they didn't cough up the cash. And when Cardinal Buczynski, Archbishop of Esztergom, died on the 11th of June, the king ordered his men to enter the archbishop's properties and seize all of the late occupants' treasures. Around the same time, Louis's wife, Queen Mary von Habsburg, arrived in Buda, and the royal couple immediately set about begging for aid from the other realms. The queen writing to her brothers, the king to his uncle, to Rome and to Venice. He even begged King Henry VIII of England to try and reconcile the elected Emperor Charles and King Francis I of France, whose new war had become the central concern of European geopolitics. Only Louis's uncle, King Sigismund of Poland-Lithuania, sent aid in time, and even that was not much. At the end of June 1521, Sultan Suleiman besieged the fortress of Shabatz, while the Grand Vizier put Belgrade under siege with a lesser force. Both fortresses were under-equipped and undersupplied. Both lacked gunpowder, a trait also shared with other fortresses along the Danube, who were unable to stop the Ottoman fleet from sailing up to Belgrade. But the Ottomans still expected Belgrade to be a formidable fortress, and it does not appear that the Sultan had wanted to capture it on this campaign. On the 8th of July, word reached Buda that Shabatz had fallen, and it was assumed that the Sultan was about to cross the river Sava. However, whatever Suleiman's original plans were, they were scuppered by a prolonged flooding of the Sava, which didn't allow him to cross. And then word reached him that the Grand Vizier had captured the castle of Zemun, the last nearby castle that had supplied and supported Belgrade, meaning that the great fortress was now completely surrounded. Suleiman turned his army east and marched on Belgrade, joining the Grand Vizier's forces at the beginning of August. Should Belgrade fall, almost nothing would stand in the way of the Ottoman army marching up the Danube all the way to Buda. When the Sultan offered the fortress commander Weissban Olaf of Belgrade the choice between money and a torturous death, Olaf replied that they had plenty of Turks to eat until the king arrived. Suleiman was overly cautious and the Belgrade garrison overconfident. They had both made the same mistake. Both were expecting the king's army to show up at any moment. But the royal army had only left Buda in mid-July, and was slowly lumbering southwards, still gathering forces, while the war councils arguing and indecision caused delay. On the 29th of August, after 66 days of siege, Weissban Olaf surrendered Belgrade in exchange for safe passage for himself and his men. On that day, the king's army was at Tolna, over 200 kilometers away. The story goes that on their way home, Weissban Olaf and his men were killed by the Bey of Bosnia because of personal animosities. Having achieved a historic victory, Sultan Suleiman departed for Constantinople on the 18th of September. Around the same time, King Louis's army arrived at Mohač, and the War Council discussed potential attempts to retake Belgrade, but due to severe disagreements, the arguing lasted into October, when an epidemic swept through the camp and decimated the army, forcing the king to disband it. In search for a scapegoat for this disaster, King Louis punished the Ban of Belgrade, Ferenc Hedervari, for allowing the fortress to go undersupplied and not being at his post. The king relieved Hedervari of his office and confiscated his properties. But Belgrade was a royal fortress, dependent on the royal treasury, and this was not seen as a fair punishment, and resulted in a series of other fortress commanders handing in their resignations to the king, lest they be blamed for the loss of their undersupplied, undermanned, and under-equipped fortresses. An emergency diet summoned in November of 1521 raised taxes, again, this time even on the nobility. The money was to be used for financing of mercenary forces to be hired by the magnates. Allowing the king to have a significant mercenary force of his own, like his famed predecessor King Matthias Corvinus, was out of the question. Money was also to be used to fortify the defensive line, most importantly the fortress of Petrovaradin, or today known as Novi Sad, that was just behind Belgrade. However, the fortification efforts were impeded by raids. The Diet in November made no decision on attempting to take back Belgrade. Neither did the one in the spring of 1522. In late 1521, the Croatian noble Ivan Karlović was appointed as the new Ban of Dalmatia, Croatia, and Slavonia, and the entire western section of the border was now dependent on his ability and his purse, which was insufficient. And Karlović entered into futile negotiations with the king's guardian, George of Brandenburg, for his late wife's vast estates in Slavonia. The loss of Belgrade was devastating for the realm's standing in Europe. It confirmed what had long been feared, that the bulwark of Christendom was rotting, that the realm of Saint Stephen was the sick man of Europe. But Europe was not to act. It was occupied with the return of Habsburg influence to northern Italy and of the Sforzas to Milan. The realm had also lost its supporter, Pope Leo X, who died on the 1st of December 1521. He was succeeded in January of 1522 by Pope Hadrian VI, the first Dutch pope, and the last non-Italian pope for the next 456 years. And amidst all of this, the realm of Saint Stephen held lavish celebrations for Queen Consort Mary's coronation in December of 1521. In early 1522, King Louis and Queen Mary traveled to Prague to finally accede to the demands of the Bohemian estates and secure aid for the Ottoman border. But the spread of Lutheran preachings had reignited religious tensions in Bohemia, and unresolved issues and conflicts between the Bohemian nobility required the king's prolonged attention. While the king was in Bohemia, envoys were dispatched from the realm of Saint Stephen to garner aid from the Pope, from Venice, and the noble Stephen Esterhazy and the Bishop of Seigne were sent to address the Imperial Diet in April of 1522. They warned of the threat the Ottomans posed to Germany and the Habsburg hereditary lands, appealing directly to Archduke Ferdinand, who had recently come into possession of Austria through a secret agreement with his brother Emperor Charles. As imperial regent, Ferdinand needed a political and economic base in Germany to operate from, but he was hesitant to accept Austria, as Charles demanded that Ferdinand renounce his claims on Spain, Burgundy, and the Low Countries. But Ferdinand was won over when Charles promised him that as soon as he was crowned emperor by the Pope, he would have Ferdinand elected as King of the Romans and of Germany, that is to say, heir to the empire. It should be noted that as soon as Ferdinand arrived in Vienna, he attempted to run things in a more absolutist, Castilian manner, punishing Vienna for its rebellion after Emperor Maximilian's death by taking away some of the city's rights. But I digress. After the appeals from Esterházy and the Bishop of Senj, the Imperial Estates decided to send 25,000 soldiers to the Ottoman border. But this success undermined Bernardin Frankopan's mission to Venice. La Serenissima had sided against the Emperor in the new round of the Italian Wars, so the Grand Council informed Frankopan that they could not spare resources for external aid, and as the Emperor was already helping defend the border, they sent Frankopan on his way. In May of 1522, the fortress of Knin, the traditional meeting place of the Croatian estates, fell to the Bay of Bosnia. Upon hearing of this, the nearby fortress of Skradin was abandoned by its meager garrison, and it too was captured. This left the fortress of Klis cut off, but its captain, Peter Kružić, was determined to hold out. Meanwhile, the fortress of Jajce held out another siege, and on the other side of the realm, the fortress of Orsova fell to Ottoman forces that were apparently pursuing the Wallachian Prince Radu V, who fled to Transylvania. He had recently seized the Wallachian throne from Ottoman favorites. Voivod Zapolya and Palatine Batory thought they saw an opening to restore the buffer princedom, and mounted several campaigns to help restore Radu to the Wallachian throne. But although initially successful, Radu would be overthrown soon after Batory and Zapolya withdrew. When the promised German troops arrived in the summer of 1522, they were dispersed across the border, rendering the whole force ineffective. As the fighting was hellish and there was no money to be made, many deserted. The only German troops that remained were in the direct pay of Archduke Ferdinand, who needed them to help defend Austria. The lack of money and manpower caused competition for resources between the border commanders, while the Croatian Ban Karlović had abandoned the practice of even asking Buda for help, as it would not be provided, and he turned to Venice and the Archduke. Karlović himself was exhausted. At several points he offered Venice all of his properties and castles in exchange for an estate in Italy. The Venetians instead increased the money they sent to him to keep on fighting. It was cheaper than having to suddenly provide for the defense of a lot of new castles. Another round of diplomatic missions was dispatched in the autumn of 1522. Stephen Brodarić was sent to Rome to address the Pope and cardinals in September, while King Louis sent the Bishop of Srem and the Croatian Diet sent Bernardin Frankopan to speak to the autumn session of the Imperial Diet at Nuremberg. There they coordinated with the papal legate Ceregatti as to how to present their case to the Diet. On the 19th of November, Ceregatti opened with a speech about church reform and the general threat of the Ottomans to Christendom. He was followed by Bernardin Frankopan, who pleaded for aid for his wretched Croatian homeland, the shield and gate of Christendom, that his Holy Royal Majesty Louis, by the grace of God, King of Hungary and our dearest ruler, having lost his best fortress of Belgrade, cannot help us, nor defend us. He added a note of personal testimony. We lack people, and those we do have were themselves twice or thrice ransomed from the Turk. I remember the destruction of over 100 fortresses, castles, and towns, horrific massacres on my properties. If Croatia were to come under Turkish rule, God forbid it, a path would open up for these animals into any land they choose, any province belonging to your highnesses. And the Bishop of Srem finished the presentation, reminding the audience that for the past 150 years, Hungary had, with much loss of life and treasure, stood guard as the bastion and bulwark of Christendom. But after the fall of Belgrade, it could not keep back the Mohammedan foe without help. As impassioned as the speeches were, Bernardin Frankopan had made a mistake. He mentioned the Turkish offers of protection in exchange for tribute and safe passage for the raiders, and not warning anyone about the coming raids. He of course assured the imperial diet that he personally had refused all of these offers, but in December, his son Krsto Frankopan faced questions in Rome about rumors that his father had been making deals with Turks, especially as Rome had received complaints from the inhabitants of Seine that the Frankopans had made a deal with the Turks to conquer the former familial holding. Some say Frankopan had also made a further error by pleading a second time before the Diet on the 22nd of November, and mentioning the fact that he had no money for his stay or travel, and was thankful for the intervention of the Archduke. It is thought that a man of Bernardin Frankopan's social status, that is to say a member of the nobility, should not talk about money, especially not having any. In December, Bernardin Frankopan made a last address to the Diet, thanking them for giving him 50 florins for his expenses, to which the Archduke added another 300. He also thanked the Diet for giving him 20 arquebuses and enough gunpowder his horses could carry. Whether this was aid or pity is a matter of debate. The Imperial Diet did authorize a further 4,000 soldiers to be sent to fight the Ottomans, but they were now also very concerned about a rebellion of Imperial Knights that had broken out in the autumn of 1522, apparently inspired by Luther's preachings. As for Luther himself, he had emerged from his captivity, during which he translated the New Testament into German, and under the protection of the Prince Elector of Saxony, he wrote a new catechism and began giving Mass in the vernacular, with more participation of the laity. But Luther's movement gave rise to far more radical thinkers, as some of Luther's followers started to feel that he did not go far enough. Some felt that Luther still maintained the sinful separation of spiritual and temporal life. At the end of the year 1522, on the 22nd of December, Sultan Suleiman had conquered Rhodes after a half-a-year-long siege, expelling the Knights Hospitalier from their centuries-old stronghold. And while everything mentioned was going on, the ship Victoria, under the command of Juan Sebastián Elcano, returned to Spain after circumnavigating the globe. King Louis and Queen Mary returned from Prague in early 1523, on the demands of the Hungarian estates. The king had managed to secure some aid for the Ottoman border from the Bohemian Diet, but he had left Bohemia in much the same unstable state he found it in 1522. Upon their return to Buda, the monarch and consort found a developing financial and political catastrophe. The royal treasurer, Bishop Paul Varaday of Veszprém, could not find the funds for the treasury. Confidence in the currency had plummeted because of the debasement measures of 1521, and foreign aid had been cut off. Archduke Ferdinand, Venice, and the papacy refused to transfer any money to the treasury, instead giving it directly to select fortresses and commanders. The papal nuncio, Baron Burgio, was under strict orders to give nothing to the royal treasury, as Rome believed that it would be squandered. The papacy also demanded that the now monk Paul Tomori, who had previously proven himself a capable warrior, who was zealous, popular with soldiers, who stayed out of court intrigue and could be trusted with money, be made the Archbishop of Kalosha and Captain General of the realm. The king and the estates agreed, and Tomori had to be, figuratively, dragged out of his monastery. At the Diet of 1523, the king faced calls to remove Palatine Batory. The estates accused him of embezzling and counterfeiting 1 million florins and cooperating with Ottoman spies. The charges were absurd, but the anger was real. The estates were looking for someone to blame for the current state of affairs, and along with Batory, anger was turned against the Lutherans and foreigners, against the free royal cities with their populations of foreign German Lutherans, against the Fugger banking clan that owned several mines in Hungary, and against the Lutheran lioness herself, Queen Consort Mary von Habsburg. She had allegedly returned from Prague with luggage full of Lutheran pamphlets. It was also now claimed that the king was under malevolent influences. In its anger, the Diet pushed through anti-Lutheran measures, persecuting and burning what little Lutheran books and preachers there actually were in the realm. The king calmed tensions by dismissing Báthory as Palatine, but then reinstated him after the Diet dissolved. This of course made the estates angrier, and the following year, 1524, the Diet demanded the expulsion of all foreigners from the realm, including ambassadors, with the exception of the king's Bohemian courtiers. In its more lucid moments, the Diet quibbled over the inheritance of the lords of Ilok. Our old friend Lovro had passed away with no heirs. Another prominent figure to die in 1524 was George St. Mary, who was made Archbishop of Esztergom in 1523. As had happened after the death of Cardinal Bakach, the king attempted to seize the archbishop's treasures, only to find that St. Mary had not accumulated as much as his predecessor had. Soon after, St. Mary's protégé, Chancellor Szalkai, was made the new primate of the realm. And during all of this internal upheaval, the border continued to collapse. In 1523, the castle of Ostrovice fell. Another campaign into Wallachia achieved nothing, and Archbishop Tomory won a Pyrrhic victory near Petrovaradin in August. The following year, Jajce, Klis and Turnus Severin were besieged, and while Jajce held out and Klis was saved by a desperate charge out of the fortress, Turnus Severin fell. The Ottomans then demolished it and Orsova so that they couldn't be recaptured. Voivod Zápolya had been sent to relieve Turnus Severin, but he couldn't do it due to lack of soldiers and money. After the fortress fell, Zápolya and a few of his magnate supporters, allegedly, contemplated using what troops they did have to stage a coup, and force the king to oust Báthory and install a new royal council. However, at the time, the king just happened to have a lot of troops from Bohemia around him, who were on their way to the border, so nothing happened. At this time, King Louis was also communicating with the Shah of Persia, discussing a joint strategy against the Ottoman Sultan, as it was rumored that the Ottomans had suffered defeats in the east. But the distance between the two realms was too great to make any coordination possible. However, Louis made more realistic proposals for the recapture of Belgrade to his uncle King Sigismund of Poland-Lithuania and his brother-in-law Archduke Ferdinand. Sigismund advised his nephew to not pursue Belgrade, lest he suffer the fate of Vladislav of Varna, and Ferdinand said that he did not have troops to spare. His brother needed them for the war against that supporter of the Lutheran, that ally of the Turk, that king of the French, who was now diplomatically isolated and had, out of desperation, reached out to Emperor Charles's enemies. Ferdinand told Louis he'd only be able to spare more troops if the realm's coinage was fixed, so the soldiers could be paid, and then only if Louis could guarantee the defense of the Croatian section of the border in order to protect Austria. In the words of one historian, reforming the coinage was difficult. Croatia was impossible. The Croatian estates themselves were now dependent on either Ferdinand or Venice for aid, and were in frequent communication with both. The idea of ending the union with Hungary, as it was providing nothing, was being seriously considered. There was just no agreement on what to replace it with. The king, either aware of these sentiments or attempting to respond to Ferdinand's request, appointed his loyal courtier, John Tahi, as Koban to Ivan Karlovich. But this only made things worse, as it caused a crisis of leadership in Croatia. In August of 1524, the Croatian Diet demanded that the king appoint only one Ban, and if he didn't do so, they threatened negotiations with the Sultan. A threat which would have carried far more weight had it not been invoked many times over the last decade. The king himself had also overused it in his requests for aid abroad. Karlovich ended the crisis of leadership in Croatia by resigning in the autumn of 1524, and he was replaced by the king's childhood friend Ferenc Batani as the new Koban, until Tahi resigned a year later. Some members of the Croatian estates wrote to the Archduke to ask him to proclaim a new Ban. Some minor nobles also asked that it be someone who was not a Croatian magnate, as they feared the magnates were scheming to turn them all into peasants. But Ferdinand refused, as it would have amounted to usurping Croatia from his brother-in-law. Instead, he sent what aid he could and made deals with individual nobles. The Croatian magnate Nicholas Zrinski gave Ferdinand several of his fortresses and estates on the river Una for 2 years, to be manned by Ferdinand's soldiers and maintained with Ferdinand's money, while Zrinski would receive a salary as a cavalry commander. Ferdinand had also asked for the income from the Zrinski's silver mine at Gvozdansko, but King Louis put a stop to that part of the deal. As an aside, after the fall of Knin, the Diet of Dalmatia and Croatia was left without a traditional meeting place, and there would be attempts to have the Croatian and Slavonian diets sit together, if for no other reason than for the convenience of the office of the Ban of Dalmatia, Croatia and Slavonia, who was supposed to preside over the diets. But the Slavonian estates refused. They wanted to protect their traditions and avoid a sudden influx of members with different interests and influences. The realm of St. Stephen in the year of our Lord 1525 was on the edge of financial collapse and civil war. The treasury was forced to stop minting copper coins as soldiers refused to take the debased and inflated currency as payment, and the Diet of early 1525 opened with angry demands for the expulsion of the Fugger banking clan from the realm and frenzied accusations of high treason against Palatine Báthory and Chancellor Archbishop Šalkaj. The Diet became so obstructive that King Louis was forced to dissolve it, as nothing could be accomplished. A number of nobles were thrown into prison for severe misbehavior, among which was snobbily heckling Chancellor Šalkaj as the son of a shoemaker. One of the nobles in that group was Krzysztof Rankopan, who had recently come into King Louis's service and led a successful relief of the fortress of Jajce, establishing his status as a war hero. But Frankopan was angry with Šalkaj, as the Chancellor had, again, denied his family's claim to the town and royal fortress of Senj. After a short stint in prison, Krzysztof Rankopan left King Louis's service and returned to Archduke Ferdinand's. On the 24th of June, thousands of minor nobles assembled under arms at Hatvan near Buda, threatening to defend their liberties if the king didn't concede to their demands, and sacked Báthory and Šalkaj. The king relented, and Báthory and Šalkaj were out, along with other members of the royal council who willingly resigned, and ran for their lives. Simultaneously, the king was forced to appoint Stephen Verbozzi as Palatine, the first at least in a long while to not come from the ranks of the magnates, while the chancellorship was given to the royal treasurer Paul Varadaj. The Diet also demanded that he be made Archbishop of Esztergom, but that was a concession that the king could not give. The new Palatine then passed measures revoking the Fugger family's mining rights. The Fuggers then cut off the flow of their money into the realm, which meant that among other financial problems the miners didn't get paid, which caused a miners' revolt, which then had to be put down by Verbozzi. King Louis and Queen Mary soon managed to get the situation back under their control by winning over a portion of the minor nobility and breaking Verbozzi's majority and political momentum. The king was also planning a visit to Slavonia and Croatia in 1525 to win over the support of the Croatian and Slavonian estates, as separation and dethronement were being actively discussed, but the visit was cancelled due to fears of a military build-up by the Beg of Bosnia. There was also unrest in Bohemia as the Catholics and conservative Hussites made an alliance at the Diet, and passed measures for their reconciliation and unification, and the repression of the Lutherans, which of course caused resistance from Lutherans and pro-Lutheran Hussites. Meanwhile, religious and social unrest had been spreading throughout southern Germany since the previous year. A great peasant rebellion had broken out, and the peasants' social and economic problems and grievances combined with a new religious fervor. They demanded an end to serfdom, less taxes, rights to fish and hunt, rights to elect their own priests, and they based all of them on Holy Scripture, God's law, as Luther's followers had taught them. This differentiated the peasants' revolt in Germany from other contemporary peasants' revolts, which based their claims upon old rights, a return to a conception of a previous fair order of things. The peasants' rebellion in Germany put Luther himself in a dilemma. He had recently lost popularity and friends, as Erasmus of Rotterdam accused him of bringing about unrest, as the rebels were using Luther's writings to justify their actions. Luther feared that this would delegitimize his teachings before the authorities and endanger his reformation of the Church. So Luther renounced the bandits and murderers who abused and misinterpreted his writings. He denied the peasants' right to rebellion, as true Christian freedom was internal. Luther lost popularity with the rebelling masses, and gave legitimacy in religious matters to the imperial princes, upon whose protection he now depended. This began the Princes' Reformation. Luther had broken the wall that had been building for most of the Middle Ages, between spiritual and temporal authority within Catholicism. Religious questions were now in the purview of temporal rulers and their politics. The Peasants' Rebellion would last into the following year, and it was crushed by the army of the Swabian League in its final coordinated action, before relations between its members broke down. Not much help came from imperial authority, as Archduke Ferdinand, in his role as imperial regent, was forced to tell the princes to fend for themselves. Not only did he have to fight the rebellion in parts of Austria, but many of his soldiers were tied up in the war with France in Italy, where, in February of 1525, a shockwave was sent throughout Europe, and Habsburg hegemony no longer seemed like geopolitical theory. Elected Emperor Charles's imperial forces won a great victory at the Battle of Pavia, capturing King Francis of France, who was soon imprisoned in Madrid. After this, the war stalemated. The French had lost their leadership and the Habsburg side was running out of money. The Queen Mother of France, Louise of Savoy, now ruling in her son's stead, and possibly under his instructions, reached out to Sultan Suleiman in search of an alliance against elected Emperor Charles. If the Sultan does not agree to an alliance, then Emperor Charles would become the ruler of the world. The first French mission sent by the Queen Mother to the Sultan got lost in Bosnia, and was possibly killed by Ottoman soldiers, as the Beg of Bosnia forwarded their letters to Constantinople. The second French mission went through intermediaries, allegedly the Frankopan family. Suleiman apparently rebuffed the idea of an alliance, especially as the French were not exactly in a strong position at this point, but the French court and the illustrious Porte continued talking. It was also in 1525 that Suleiman and King Sigismund of Poland-Lithuania signed a truce. King Sigismund then strongly advised his young nephew, King Louis II of Hungary, Bohemia, Dalmatia, Croatia, and Slavonia to do the same. The Diet of the Kingdom of Dalmatia and Croatia met at Križevci in the first months of 1526. On the agenda was the question of dethronement and replacement of King Louis II and an end to the union with Hungary. One faction, among whose leaders was Krsto Frankopan, advocated for Archduke Ferdinand von Habsburg to be elected King of Dalmatia and Croatia. Another faction wanted to come to an arrangement with the Republic of Venice. A small faction argued that a deal should be made with the Sultan, and part of the Diet still advocated for the status quo, so no consensus was reached and the Diet disbanded without making a decision. In March of 1526, Archbishop Paul Tomory of Kalosha rushed from the border fortress of Petrovaradin to inform King Louis that Sultan Suleiman was making preparations for a campaign. The king immediately summoned the Diet of the realm to gather in April. At the Diet, the king, queen, and their supporters seized the moment and ousted Palatine Verbozzi, condemning him to loss of property under accusations of high treason. Stephen Batory was restored to the office of Palatine, and Stephen Brodarić, the Bishop of Sriem, was appointed as the new chancellor. The king and queen also managed to get the Diet to accept measures that would strengthen royal authority, and then at the end of April, news and rumor arrived that the Sultan had departed Constantinople at the head of an army of 200,000 men. The actual army was at most half of that. The king ordered that the noble banners should prepare and join the king's army at Tolna on the 2nd of July. The new chancellor, Stephen Brodarić, began a frantic search for money, weapons, and supplies. He raised emergency taxes and even seized church funds, but gathering sufficient funds in such a short time was now a struggle. The chancellery sent requests for aid throughout Europe, but aside from the king's own Bohemian soldiers, a few units of mercenaries from Poland, Lithuania, and a possible contingent being prepared by the king's guardian George of Brandenburg in Germany, the requests for aid fell on deaf ears. When Krsto Frankopan was summoned from Archduke Ferdinand's service to take command over part of the army, some speculate it was hoped that he would arrive with German reinforcements. The papal nuncio for the realm of St. Stephen, Baron Burgio, wrote an assessment of the situation to Pope Clement VII. If the Sultan does indeed come, then I repeat myself for the 100th time, Your Holiness can consider this land lost. Chaos without end has infected the realm, and materials for war do not exist. One question is, what prompted this sudden Ottoman campaign? Rumor at the time said that there had been a Janissary revolt in Constantinople, during which the Grand Vizier Ibrahim had to escape through a window half naked. And one of the ways to appease and reassert control over the soldiers was for the Sultan to go on military campaign. But there was a grander strategic reason. King Francis I of France, in January of 1526, while still imprisoned in Madrid, agreed to a very humiliating peace treaty with elected Emperor Charles V. In exchange for his freedom, the French king renounced his claims in Italy and agreed to return parts of Burgundy and the Low Countries to Charles. However, the moment Francis returned to Paris, he renounced the treaty, and in February of 1526, the exchange of letters between Paris and Constantinople led to an effective alliance. It was to the benefit of both sides to prevent a Habsburg victory over France and hegemony in Europe. The Sultan, of course, wanted to avoid a united Europe, so they would divide Charles's forces between two fronts. A grand Ottoman invasion in the east would relieve some of the pressure off of France in the west, and the Sultan had to show his full force in order to do that. But should the Sultan not come through, new options opened up for France. The Battle of Pavia had scared Europe, and an anti-Habsburg coalition formed. On the 22nd of May 1526, King Francis of France, the Pope, the republics of Venice and Genoa and Florence, and the Duke of Milan, with the protection of the King of England, formed the League of Cognac against elected Emperor Charles. The elected emperor was also facing internal problems. With the war against France and the Peasants' War ongoing within the empire, The imperial brothers had to give way to the Lutheran princes at the Diet of Speyer in the spring of 1526, or face not receiving imperial taxes at best, or civil war at worst. Archduke Ferdinand, acting as imperial regent, allowed the princes to enact the anti-Lutheran Edict of Worms within their territories in any way they saw fit, including not at all. Seeing these developments, elected Emperor Charles wrote to Pope Clement in June of 1526, accusing the Pope of leading the Church to disaster and unity of Christians to ruins. Meanwhile, in the realm of St. Stephen, on the 30th of May, Papal Legate Burgio wrote to Rome that nothing had been done. Archbishop Tomori sent the king and pope strongly worded letters of complaint about a complete lack of preparation. Your Majesty and Lords have even failed to shoe the horses. He added that his garrison at Petrovaradin had not been paid for months. Tomori strongly advised the king to march immediately for Petrovaradin to block the river crossings on the major rivers, where they would have an advantage over the Sultan's greater force. Baron Burgio did help Tomori out by issuing some of the papal money to his garrison, but the king waited. If the army marched out too early, there was a danger of the army running out of money or supplies, or falling apart due to internal disagreements or conflict or disease, as had happened in 1521, before even engaging the Sultan's force. On the fated 2nd of July, Sultan Suleiman's army reached the crossings over the river Sava at Belgrade. The king with his meager forces was still in Buda, still waiting, and much of the nobility waited for the king to begin the campaign and march out of Buda, so that they could march out and meet him at Tolna, or along the way to the border. Some may have also hoped that it had all been a false alarm, and that the Sultan was not actually coming. But captured Turkish prisoners at the border confirmed the Sultan was coming. When Suleiman crossed the Sava River on the 11th of July, the Grand Vizier put siege to Petrovaradin. Archbishop Tomori had left the fortress with the majority of his forces, hoping to harass the Ottoman siege, but he was eventually forced into a fighting retreat towards the king, who was still in Buda. Petrovaradin fell to Grand Vizier Ibrahim's army on the 27th of July 1526, after what was left of the garrison attempted a breakout, motivated by an alleged sighting of King Louis II's army nearby. The king and his small portion of the army had only left Buda on the 24th of July. Soon after they left Buda, the king's favorite horse died. Some took that as a bad omen. As had happened during the events of 1521, the king's army was slowed by the fact that it only gathered strength while on the move, and as new commanders joined the army, the war council's debates lengthened. Under the advice of the war council, the king had issued orders to Voivod Janos Zapoля of Transylvania to attack the Ottomans through Vlachia and threaten the Sultan's flank, in the hope to draw off part of his force. Those orders were countermanded a few days later, ordering the voivod to join the king's army, only to be countermanded again with orders to proceed into Vlachia, which were then countermanded again with orders to join the king, and understandably after this Zapolia had had enough. He stopped his army and demanded to be given clear instructions, which arrived mid-August, to join the king, as it was now too late to attempt to draw off part of the Sultan's army eastwards. On the 23rd of August, Sultan Suleiman crossed the Drava River. On the same day, the king's army arrived at a field near Mohač, where they would wait for the rest of the army. Archbishop Tomori had recently joined the king with the forces he took out of Petrovaradin before the siege. The king was also expecting more units from Bohemia and a few contingents from Poland and from Germany. But the most significant forces, under Voivod Zapolia, the Croatian and Slavonian army under Ban Bafani, and the Croatian and hopefully German troops under Krsto Frankopan, who had only recently returned from Germany to Croatia mid-August, sans German troops, were still on their way. Both Voivod Zápolya and Krsto Frankopan strongly advised King Louis to not give battle until they arrived. Chancellor Brodarić writes, after the fact, that he himself advised the king to retreat either to Buda or as far as Pressburg and wait for reinforcements, saying that a retreat would do less damage than a defeat, even if the Turk were to ransack the whole of Hungary. At Mohač, the war council debated the fateful question, whether or not to give battle against a far larger force. While there were some misgivings among some of the commanders and magnates, most of them and most of the minor nobility had apparently convinced themselves in the inevitability of victory. A hunger for battle was also present among soldiers. Apparently some soldiers from Archbishop Tomori's camp even threatened to attack the king's army if there was even a whiff of retreat. But to not follow the old narrative of overconfidence completely and give them some benefit of the doubt. What would a retreat do? It might save this disorganized and disunited mass that called itself an army, but it would open up the heart of the kingdom to tens of thousands of Ottoman raiders, creating long-term damage. That was a certainty. What did it matter if the army survived? There was no guarantee that it could be reassembled to fight another day. But the Ottomans would continue to grind down the army and the realm as they had done for decades. But if battle was given, there was a chance to turn things around, a chance to lob the head off of the snake and send the Ottoman Sultanate into chaos, buying at least a few years of peace. The horrible certainty offered by the retreat versus the hopeful chance of victory. And all of those who were clamoring for battle had time on their side. With each hour that the war councils dragged on, a retreat became more and more dangerous and battle inevitable. The Sultan's army was drawing closer, and when patrols began skirmishing, a retreat was near impossible. And while Ottoman forces rested, King Louis's army stood at the ready for several days and nights, expecting an attack. But the days of debate had also meant that little to no defensive preparations had been made, and the advice of one of the Polish mercenary commanders to prepare trenches and war wagons went unheeded, as those would only hinder the army if a move was ordered. On the 28th of August, Ban Bafani finally arrived with his Croatian and Slavonian army. It had been delayed due to the estates of Slavonia refusing to march until it was certain that the Sultan had crossed the Drava and would not attack them. It is estimated that at this point King Louis's army numbered around 25,000 troops. There were various kinds of infantry and some cannons that had arrived on riverboats from Vienna, but the majority of the army was light cavalry. The decades of the border war had forced many of the medieval knights to discard their armor in order to be able to chase Ottoman raiders, and the raids had also decreased income and increased the costs of military maintenance. But I digress. King Louis also lacked military command experience, so command was given, forced on, Archbishop Tomori and the voivode's brother George Zápolya, both of whom protested that they also lacked experience in commanding a large army against an even larger enemy force. They reluctantly accepted command after being told that Voivod Zápolya and Frankopan would take over command as soon as they arrived. The Ottoman forces advanced closer to the king's army on the 29th of August and camped out on a few nearby hills. The Sultan is assumed to have wanted the army to rest and attack the next morning. But suddenly, King Louis's army attacked. Archbishop Tomori, believing that a smaller Ottoman force had separated itself from the Sultan's army, urged the king to attack it. Engaging a part of the army now is better than the whole army tomorrow. The attack routed the smaller force, but upon realizing that the Sultan's army was much closer than they had assumed, the only option left was to turn and charge. As the army fell into chaos around him, the young King Louis rallied his cavalry and led several charges directly for the Sultan. He failed to break through the enemy line. In less than 2 hours, King Louis's army was destroyed. 10,000 men were massacred. Thousands of minor nobles perished in and after battle, along with 25 magnates and 7 prelates, among whom were George Zapoля, Archbishop Szalkai, and Archbishop Tomori, whose head was taken as a prize by the Sultan, while the Judge Royal John Dragfe was allegedly found still clutching the royal banner in his dead hands. Suleiman waited for 3 more days at Mohač, waiting to see if any reinforcements would come to the king's army, but none came. One story says that the Sultan wondered, was this it? Was this all there was of that rich and prosperous realm that had defied the Ottoman sultans since the days of King Louis I the Great? As for the young Louis II, Jagiellon, King of Hungary, of Bohemia, of Dalmatia, Croatia, and Slavonia, of Rama, of Serbia, Galicia, Lodomeria, Cumania, and Bulgaria, Prince of Silesia and of Luxembourg, Margrave of Moravia and of Upper and Lower Lusatia. He escaped the battle and rode to save his life, but fell off of his horse and drowned in his armor in a stream not far from the battlefield. This event marks the end of the Middle Ages for this part of Europe, and with this milestone, I would like to thank everyone who's been following me for these past 6 years. Thank you all for watching, and see you again very soon, when this history continues. And a little digression before you go. According to an Ottoman chronicle, apparently at some point in the 50 to 100 years after the battle, the locals at Mohač would refer to the hill that Sultan Suleiman occupied as the Emperor's Hill, and the stream where King Louis drowned as the King's Stream.